Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Prove Me Wrong podcast. As always, I'm your host, Pete Lieb, and I'm glad to have you back with me again tonight. Tonight, we are going to take on the true crime genre again and tell the tragic story of Susan Cox Powell, her husband, Josh, and their two boys, Charlie and Braden, with my guest, author Rebecca Morris. Rebecca is the author of the true crime book, If I Can't Have You, Susan Powell, Her Mysterious Disappearance and the Murder of Her Children, which tells the almost unbelievable story of a missing mother, an erratic father, and ultimately the death of an entire family unit from what I would personally consider, after reading it, just a breakdown or loopholes within the system, within several of our most important societal institutions, and we'll uncover that and discuss that tonight. If you are watching on YouTube or on Rumble, I have also put the cover of the book on the screen here, and I actually have my copy right there, dog-eared and highlighted and written in the margins. It's something you can take a look at. You can find that on RebeccaTMorris.com and on Amazon.com as well. Rebecca is a New York Times bestselling author, a veteran journalist who worked in radio and television news in New York City, Portland, and Seattle, and was a freelance writer for the Seattle Times, the Oregonian, People, Entertainment Weekly, the New York Daily News, the New York Post, and many other publications. Her newest book, Boy Missing, The Search for Kyron Horman, is the only book about 7-year-old boy who vanished from his Portland, Oregon school, on June 4th, 2010. She spent 3 years interviewing his family and friends trying to answer two questions. Where is Kyron, and why hasn't the woman believed responsible for his disappearance been charged? Her first book is also Ted and Ann and continues to be a bestseller on Amazon. It's also available as an ebook and an audiobook. And her book, Bad Apples, Inside the Teacher-Student Sex Scandal Epidemic, is the only book that looks at the trend of female teachers having sex with underage students, which is something we hear, unfortunately, quite a bit about. Once again, you can find her online, RebeccaTMorris.com and Amazon.com. And welcome, Rebecca, to the podcast. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you, Pete. Holding down the fort here in Seattle.
Absolutely. Can you give me a little bit more history, just for a few moments, about how you became involved with the story of Susan Powell?
Well, I co-wrote the book with Greg Olson, who's a very familiar name around true crime books and also fiction. And we were watching the case from December 6th, 2009, when Susan Powell disappeared. The thing about a story like this, and this is true of the Kyron Horman case too, which you just mentioned, is that it's not a book right away. You kind of have to sit and wait and see what happens.
Yeah. Publishers
like an ending. I think sometimes no ending is an ending. But there's usually going to be arrests, adjudication, trials, and some kind of conviction or acquittal, and then there'll be a book. But as the time passed with the Susan Cox Powell case, and the story just kept, I've never in my life seen a story, or heard of a story that just kept making news, that just kept unfolding. And so I watched the story for several years, and then on February 5th, 2012, Josh killed the kids and himself, and that seemed to be the ending. And it actually wasn't, but, I started writing the book the day after he killed the kids and himself. By then, Susan had been missing about 2.5 years. And so that's how that came about. With the Kyron Horman book, I followed it for 7 years before I spent the 3 years writing it. So I am very intrigued by stories that publishers are leery of, and especially missing people stories. And I think they're the ultimate mysteries. These are both terribly sad. And the Ted and Ann book that you mentioned about Ted Bundy's childhood and youth that's about what might be his first case, a girl who's been missing since 1961 and still no trace ever found. So I asked myself this last year, what is it about missing person cases that, really involves me and attracts me? And I think they're the ultimate mystery. It's the ultimate sadness. And I think they're more difficult stories to tell, frankly, which I'm attracted to. It's much more difficult than somebody committed a murder, they were arrested, they were tried, charged, convicted, and that's it. These are not tidy stories at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they're about something. To me, the Susan Cox Powell story, it's about something. It's about a patriarchal religion. There are many things I learned and to respect about the Mormon Church, but there's no question that she stayed married because she was supposed to. And it's about, two states botching a criminal investigation by not communicating with each other, Utah and Washington State. And it's about how Child Protective Services, or in Washington State called DSHS, allowed, Josh was a person of interest in his wife's disappearance, yet he had custody of his children after she disappeared. And then once they were removed and in foster care with Susan's parents, he was allowed to see them at a obscure rental house that he pretended he was living there and he wasn't. And that's where he shut the door on the caseworker who was supposed to be with him.
So before we jump too far into the eventual, let's go back just a minute and get into, if you don't mind, can you set the stage for us a bit about some of the history of Susan Cox at the time and Josh Powell? What was some of their early life like, and how did they meet?
Well, Susan was one of 4 daughters, good Mormon family, Chuck and Judy Cox, who lived in Puyallup, Washington. And Josh was the son of Mormon parents at that time. His father had left the church, but his mother still was Mormon. And his parents had divorced when he was a teenager. And we know now from their divorce documents in the 1990s just how troubled the family was in his teenage years. But they met at what is kind of common. Young Mormons meet at social events that the church has for young people to meet. Courtships are very short in the church because you can't have intimacy before marriage. So they dated a few months and then married pretty young.
And how did, from what I read in the book, their relationship was different prior to the children? How did the birth of the first son and then ultimately both of their sons, how did that change their family dynamic?
Well, Josh seemed to be just a gawky, young man in love when they met and got married. And, the Coxes tell stories about how odd he was. He was odd. He was quirky. His friends knew that. But he really looked to be in love. And they moved away from Washington State. They moved to Utah basically to get away from Josh's father, Steve Powell, who was sexually obsessed with his daughter-in-law, Susan. And, I read his 20,000-page journal, and he was really, really sickeningly obsessed with her. But they moved to Utah, and soon after had 2 young sons. And Josh just kind of lost interest in the marriage. He didn't really act like a father, or that he wanted to be a father. If the kids were home on a day when Susan was working and Josh was home, he'd be in the basement on his computers, and he'd hire a babysitter, to be in the house with them. That whole custody fight after Susan was missing and he was trying for the kids, it wasn't because he wanted to be a father. He just wanted to win.
Well, not to let the cat out of the bag on that either. I had thoughts about that as well. I had thoughts that his reason for wanting the kids was because he was afraid of what they would say when they were out from under him. And he was afraid because there were times when they were out from under him, when they had talked to police or when they had talked to friends, and they mentioned that maybe mom was with them when she allegedly went missing. I think that he was just afraid of what they might say, and the easiest way to keep control of that is to keep them with him. And also just from his, there seemed to be a lot, and I don't know if anybody had mentioned it, and you did mention it a little bit in the book, there seemed to be a lot of undiagnosed mental illness with Josh. I'm sorry. The way he acted, and he had these grandiose perceptions of himself, the know-it-all, talking constantly, always on to the next scheme, always on to the next thing. He would get incredibly focused on something for a short period of time and then abandon it. And honestly, I thought that was probably more than likely what happened with his marriage in general. Anyway, she was something he got focused on very briefly. You know, he was incredibly focused, like he is on his computers or his remote control cars or all that stuff that's in his garage.
Right. Yeah.
And he just gets very focused on that, and that's all he can think about, and then it's over. And I think that unfortunately his wife fell into that category eventually. He was just no longer interested in that. He was moving on to the new thing. Was there ever any discussion, and I know you'd mentioned it maybe bipolar in the book, was there ever any type of evaluation or anything like that to look at his mental competency?
Well, not before it was ordered by the court, just before he killed himself and the kids. But his parents' divorce documents, his mother told stories about his threatening her with a kitchen knife.
Yeah.
You know, when he was a teenager. And, you know, there was a long family history of dysfunction. You know, his father, Steve, his parents were always at war with each other, and they were kidnapping their kids, and Steve didn't know quite, you know, where he belonged, and sometimes living with one parent, sometimes with the grandparents, and then they'd be kidnapped again. So there are just lots of problems. And I see that in a lot of crimes I write about. You're not born, I don't think, with wanting to kill.
Right.
You know, you learn these things, and you maybe inherit some patterns. But you're right. He was, you know, what his friends early on chalked up to just quirkiness. He'd get very involved with selling real estate, and that lasted maybe a month.
Right.
Put him deeply in debt. And then there were other things he, you know, tried and could never quite bring it off.
He always had the scheme. He was very great at having the scheme, but the follow through on the scheme was where he faltered. And so he couldn't keep couldn't hold a job for more than a month, a couple of weeks. I mean, he was great at
very spotty.
So that to me, again, that goes along with that entire, that self-worth, the impression that he has of himself. You know, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. But then when you realize, there's actually work involved in doing that.
Yeah.
Okay. He was for the get rich quick if he can. And Susan was the primary breadwinner, right? She was the one who actually had to make all the money because he couldn't hold a job. But he was incredibly controlling of the family finances, right?
Yeah, when he started to work in real estate, he wanted her to also. So she did briefly, as long as he lasted. But then she went to Wells Fargo Bank and worked for them for several years. And he just became, you know, his old friends didn't recognize him. And, you know, I wanted to find people who cared about Josh, who liked him before all of this happened. And they did see big changes in him after, you know, a few years in Utah. But they had two vehicles. He sold one, and he wouldn't let Susan take the other one to work. And one winter in the snow, he made her ride a bike, you know, to the bank, which was 3 or 4 or 5 miles away.
Wow.
And, you know, not giving her enough money to feed the boys. She'd call her good friends in the neighborhood and said, you know, do you have some hot dogs I could borrow or something? And, you know, it's hard from outside to understand, well, she was making the money, why didn't she have any access to it? And she told her friends that he was always changing their password and everything. But the fact that she didn't have the money to go and buy food for her kids, and or he'd want her to grow everything, the family ate in the backyard, and that's she had an awful lot that she was responsible for.
And I think to what you just said there, how most people don't understand. Well, she makes the money. Why doesn't she have control of the money?
Yeah.
You are talking in a very 20th century United States frame of mind, whereas what they were living in, you mentioned it before, the patriarchal structure of the Mormon Church, and she was and from all impressions, she was a devout follower of that. That she lived by those tenets. And so she lived by the tenets of respecting your husband and doing what he was telling her to do.
Yeah.
So she allowed him, even though she, in reality, had all the power. She had the financial power. She was the one making the money. She allowed him to then take that from her, based on those beliefs. So that
she did.
Yeah. So that's something that's hard for people to wrap their brain around, because we all live in a modern world now, and we think that I make the money, I keep the money. That's not the way everybody lives, right? So her disappearance, can you break it down for me, would you? Just kind of give us the timeline on what happened. I believe it was December 7th. And that's an interesting date, because it's already a date that's burned in your brain for something, for a different reason. So when, it wasn't hard for me to remember that date. But so December 7th, the story is he goes camping in the middle of the night with the two boys, and then she takes that as her opportunity to split, right? How did that happen?
Yeah. Well, it was a snow, there's a lot of snow in Utah in the winter. And they lived in West Valley City, which is a suburb of Salt Lake City. And, I was really interested to learn everything I could. And their neighborhood, for instance, is everybody who lives in the neighborhood who belongs to that particular ward, or the local Mormon church ward. You don't go to temple every Sunday. You walk to your ward. So her best friends were other Mormon mothers, in this neighborhood. And her friend, Debbie Caldwell, who's her child care provider, drives up Monday morning, and it snowed overnight, and there's no sign of anybody in the house. There's no tire tracks. There are no footprints up to the door. There's nothing. And finally, some other people gather, and Josh's sister, and she gives the police authority to break into the house, to go through a window. And they find Susan's purse and cell phone are by the bedside table. Her one pair of winter boots are in the living room. There's an electric fan working at this wet spot on a carpet, and nobody's home. So the police try to reach Josh. Finally, he answers the phone when her friend Giovanna, who was the last person to see her the day before, calls him and basically, says, where are you? Where's Susan? And he pretends that he doesn't know. He assumes she went to work. He and the kids went camping on Sunday night. Now, winter camping is a real thing in Utah, and it sounds kind of miserable, but people do it. He wasn't necessarily outfitted for winter camping. We know now what was in his van, and it was things like soldering tools and wrap that you'd wrap a tree in, and all this weird stuff that he bought in the last week or two at big box stores. But he finally drives up, and before the police let him out of the van, they notice there's a pink cell phone on the seat next to him. Well, he's got Susan's cell phone. I think I said earlier the cell phone was by the bed, but the purse was. But he has her cell phone.
Right.
And they learned very quickly that he'd actually called it a few minutes before to leave a message. Susan, I'm here picking you up at Wells Fargo. Where are you? So obviously somebody trying to cover their tracks.
Just in that first sentence, so much circumstantial evidence right there. He's telling you he doesn't know where she is. He assumes she went to work. We only have one automobile, and I have it, but I'm assuming she went to work.
Yeah.
And secondarily, I don't know where she is, but her phone is right here on the seat with me. And I've called it 3 times over the last couple of hours looking for her. It's a comedy of, again, that to me speaks to his, he has the plan, but the follow through, he's miserable at. He couldn't even get that right.
You're right.
He couldn't dispose of the phone. He couldn't dispose of the purse. He could do none of those things that, normally somebody who, but what gets it, that's where I began to get mad. I'll be honest with you. I don't know how far into the story that was. Maybe, 20 pages in, 30
Not
pages
very far.
Because you started with the disappearance in the book.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was already mad 20 pages in. You had me right there that I was getting frustrated.
Right.
So, and Debbie Caldwell, and I'm sure you are familiar with, it just happened, the Watts case, with Shalane Watts and Chris Watts, her husband. And Debbie Caldwell to me is the friend of Shalane Watts, who understood that something was wrong almost immediately. And she gave Chris Watts no air. I mean, she was at their house within an hour. She had called the police. The police were there. Chris had no chance and no time to actually implement whatever plan he may have had. Debbie Caldwell to me is the same way. She could have easily left, said, "Oh, they're not here. They're not home. They're off somewhere," and left and not followed up. Instead, she took all these extra steps to alert the police, alert Jen Graves, who is Josh's sister, alert all these people. So he wasn't
Susan's
able.
best friend who lived down the street,
Right.
Kiersey Hillwell, was there, and Jen Graves was there, and they all had, they had Josh's number. They they knew that he had done something with her, and he wasn't good at follow through, but he'd done something. I still would give anything to know what did he. It's now very, very complicated. Where did he leave her? Because we know later in the week they moved her. He and his brother moved Susan's body. But that first night, he told the police he and the boys left about midnight. Susan had gone to bed. She wasn't feeling well. And he and the boys went to Simpson Springs, which is southeast of Salt Lake City, out in the desert in the middle of nowhere. I don't think they still are not sure exactly where he went. They know where he went 2 days later when he rented a car and disappeared. And, that's when I got mad, Pete, is that they didn't follow him. They didn't follow Josh. And he was able to take his van home that first night and clean it. Although, there are things you can't clean up completely. But they let him take the van home, and then the next day they seized it. And 2 or 3 days later, when they kept the van, he got a ride to the Salt Lake City airport. He rented a car, and he was gone for 18 hours and drove 800 miles. So why weren't they following him?
Yeah, so you had me mad already. But then, his actions with the police, the first night, and then the police actions with him. Both of them were equally frustrating to me. He had no good answers. He had no real concrete statements, at least from what I was reading. But you mentioned it. They allowed him to leave after a couple of hours. They allowed him to leave in his car after a couple of hours when his wife's phone was on the car seat, and they could prove that he had called it knowing it was sitting right there. Yeah,
of course.
All of those things.
And the blood spatters in the house were Susan's blood.
Yeah.
So there's lots of circumstantial evidence, and what I consider better than circumstantial evidence.
So how could they leave? I guess, how would they let him? Did they ever give you any rationale as to why they let him leave the first night with all of his car and with the majority of his stuff, and then how they had let him leave the state? Period. I mean, 2 weeks later, he's packing up to move completely, right?
He left they didn't know it. I mean, he drove his kids back to Puyallup for Christmas, left them, and then went back to West Valley City, packed up and moved. And they didn't know until Kiersey Hillwell, Susan's best friend, called and said, did you know what Josh Powell's been up to. So I think I think, I mean, I'm a little sympathetic. I think this police department was in over its head.
Okay.
Very quickly. And
that was going to be one of my questions was, maybe they just don't have the experience level with this type of case. It seems like they would have some experience in that area with people who go missing. You know, people, if you do out in the desert, out in the mountains, you go out hiking and you go missing, they should be, but that's what I thought. Maybe they just don't have the experience that some of these bigger police precincts might with murder situations.
Well, I've never understood then, why don't they ask for help? There's the state police, there's the Salt Lake City Police Department. But I think it's a pride thing that you don't admit that you could use some help. But, actually missing people, Utah has had a number of them. This was only a couple of years after Elizabeth Smart was abducted and was, found by chance, by luck. Somebody recognized her. And that's how, it was not because of any great police work that she was found. In fact, people are found often by chance, not by great police work. And I am often on the side of the police, but not always. And then there was another Salt Lake City woman about the same time whose husband had been leading a double life and she didn't know it. And he killed her, didn't do a very good job of it, put her body in a dumpster. So that was around the same period of time, but those both happened in Salt Lake City proper.
So when the police went to her work, she worked at Wells Fargo, and they also found a safe deposit box at her work that had, I don't know what the term for it is, but basically if I die, even if it looks like an accident, look at my husband. That is not normal, right? That is not normal.
No.
Normal people don't leave letters that say, if something happens to me, look at my husband. That alone, to me, is enough to keep him for 72 hours and sweat the hell out of him. I'm going to be honest.
Yeah, well, they didn't find that for a few days or a week or two. So they didn't know about that in time to, not let him go clean the car. But
true. But they did find out in time not to let him move to Washington. Yeah?
Well, he moved he didn't ask permission.
he just took off.
He just took off.
Okay.
And remember, there was nothing they couldn't have held him really, unless they, got him jaywalking or something. There was no reason to hold him. She'd written a handwritten will, but basically it was a letter saying, if something happens to me, you've got to look at Josh and, her hopes and desires for her sons. It was, it's heartbreaking, just heartbreaking.
I don't, and I think that was one of the themes of the book was maybe something's got to change in terms of not having the body. And that ended up being the primary reason that he was never really officially declared a suspect in the murder, because they had no body. So they continued to call him a person of interest, but not necessarily somebody that they could really hold and sweat and just put some pressure on him, because he seemed like the kind of guy to me that as soon as they put a little bit of pressure on him, he would have broken pretty quickly. I think the reason he didn't go back was because he knew that was what was going to happen, and so he was smart enough to say, I'm just going to avoid this altogether and run. And they didn't have, so I don't know why, with all of that, with again the obvious telephone in the seat, with the letter saying if I disappear, even if it looks like an accident, check out my husband. All of those things are stacking up, and they still could not find a reason to keep it.
So you mentioned the police earlier. What did they think about something? Of course, they weren't speaking. I wasn't on the job with the book until 2012, but they didn't speak to report. They occasionally had news conferences, of course, when she was missing and they were searching for her. They would have, But now the police chief is retired, and you'll see him on some of the ID shows and documentaries. And I've read that he's writing a book, but I heard him say recently, well, we were going to give Josh a year. We're going to give it a year and see if her body was found. Well, you don't just, let's give it some time. So I am very interested in what this is, which is called a no body case.
Mm-hmm.
And my Kyron Horman book, which came out in the summer of 2020, is, a good chunk of it is about how no body cases can be prosecuted and successfully prosecuted. They can be, and you can, without a body, make a case. And it's been done, it's like 400 times across the country in the last 10 years or something.
Yeah, I was going to say that I know it has happened. I couldn't pull a name out, but I know it has happened where the circumstantial evidence and the amount of evidence that something untoward has happened to someone that you were directly involved in. I mean, because how many times has somebody, I guess you get pushed off a bridge and you're gone. They don't find you. You don't find the body anymore. Now, what am I? Am I free to go? That to me was it was so frustrating to me. I'll be honest.
Yeah.
What was
prosecutors wait because if they charge somebody and that person is acquitted, they can never charge them again for murder. So if the body's found, then you can't charge them again. It's double jeopardy. So they I think they drag their heels. And, it's the prosecutor's office, the DA, who tells the police, not the police telling the prosecutor. The DA decides if there's going to be a trial, if there are going to be charges brought, and they tend to wait until a body is found. But think of the people who wait 60 years or 10 years or 15 years without knowing.
How involved was the church in the investigation? I know that the church was incredibly involved in the lives of all of these people in that area.
Yeah.
Was it also involved in the investigation? I only ask because it seems like that, obviously, in the Mormon faith was incredibly influential there.
Yeah, I'm not aware that they were involved in the investigation at all.
Okay.
People would say to me, not involved in the case, well, maybe, they went easy on Josh because he'd been Mormon or something. I don't think so. I don't think that had anything to do with it. At about the 1 week mark, there was a service not a service for Susan, but a gathering of some kind at her ward. And, Chuck came from Washington State Ford, and Josh showed up, and they exchanged a few words, outside. So I know her ward was, supportive of Susan's friends because they all belonged to the same ward. But I don't think that they played any role in it. I know that Susan had gone for marriage counseling in the church, and I got a copy and read the same book that she was told to read. Josh, I think, went once and then stopped. He wouldn't participate anymore. But I believe a friend of hers said to me that she imagined Susan was asked by the counselor, what did you do that made your husband treat you like this? So as far as that's before her disappearance, but, browbeating her, not letting her use the car, not giving her money, being cruel.
Yeah. But then that's somehow being her fault. What did you do to him to make him treat you that way?
Yeah. And I'll tell you the similarities with a book I did soon after the Powell book. It was about a murder among the Amish in Ohio. And it was incredible, the similarities. I never thought of it till I got involved with that, but that, a patriarchal religion, and of course, even on a even more rigid role for women among the Amish.
It's like blaming the rape victim for what she was wearing, right? Well,
yes,
you were wearing a skirt. What do you expect?
Yeah.
Men are going to rape you for that. That's just, wow. That's frustrating.
Yeah.
So how did, and another thing I found, there were just so many things that were frustrating to me about the whole story. And the way that everybody, all of his friends, all the people that were around him, always seemed to walk on eggshells around him. What was it about Josh that made these people all so tentative in terms of the way that they talked to him, not wanting to upset him? What was it about him and their dynamic that made it? Doesn't seem like anybody ever. It was very, very few times when somebody came right out and challenged him and asked him what had happened. Everybody else was very deferential.
So you mean after her disappearance?
Yes,
because before her disappearance, they just thought he was nuts. You know, he would talk. He would just talk for hours about, you know, rocks. He'd talk for hours about robots. He didn't know that people were bored and found him, you know, they'd laugh behind his back, but they put up with him. They put up with him because they loved Susan. He
had no circumstantial awareness. He had no awareness of what people were actually thinking of around him.
Right.
Okay.
And of course, after she went missing, and he retreated, you know, quickly to his father's house in Puyallup, where I used to call it Fort Powell. You know, Fort Powell was Steve Powell, at least his 3 sons, one of his other daughters, the grandkids, you know, and it was a gated community, except the gates were never locked, or, you know, I never had any trouble getting in there. And, you know, the neighbors would put up purple ribbons, Susan's favorite color.
Right.
And her, so Kiersey tried to stay, you know, basically Susan's closest friends tried to stay on good terms with Josh because they thought he might reveal something to them, or maybe he'd break down with them. So he wouldn't with the police, but maybe he would let them, he'd tell them something. So they tried to stay on good terms with him. But they were also very no nonsense with him, you know, and they would speak direct, Josh, you've got to do this. You've got to tell us, you know, what were you doing? What were you thinking? And, you know, and he'd shut down. And if you've seen the video of him being interviewed by the police, he just, you know, he's sitting in the corner of the room, hunched over with a cap down to his eyes. And boy, does he look guilty.
Absolutely.
As hell, just guilty. So, you know, his sister, who had escaped Fort Powell, who was living in Utah, went into Fort Powell once wearing a mic, and the police, you know, she'd gone to the police with this idea. And so there's a conversation she had where she just confronts Josh, and, you know, the whole family, you know, basically jumps on her for, you know, confronting Josh, like, you know, what'd you do? What'd you do with Susan?
Yeah.
And so none of that ever went very far. It wasn't successful at getting him to open up. Now, at about, you know, that time, well, they know from the first time that one of the children said something was the day after Susan disappeared. Charlie, who was then he was about 4.5, said, Mommy was with us. She stayed with the crystals.
Right.
And so, you know, they began to have even more memories. I think it was Braden who drew a picture of the van, and Mommy was in the very back, you know, of the van. And, but, you know, that's not proof.
And those things will fade quickly with young children as well. So you almost have to be able to try to get those
right. Yeah.
Before they go.
Yeah. And Josh and his father weren't interested in, you know, let's talk about Susan tonight. Let's sit and talk about your mommy. Oh, no. And they were telling the children, they had a lot of messages for the kids. Mormons are bad. The Coxes are bad. They're evil. Just really, really planting the seeds of hatred in those boys.
Can you talk to just a moment about some of the suspects outside of Josh? Because Josh, they felt, was obviously the main suspect, but there were others, like potentially Josh's brother Mike and his father Steve. Can you talk about them a little bit?
Well, Josh and Steve's main scenario was that Susan had run off with a man. And there was a man missing from Utah about a week before Susan went missing, who's never been found. So Josh and Steve jumped on this idea. Susan had ran away. She wasn't the mother and wife you thought she was. She ran off with another man. So, of course, that didn't go far, but that was their main scenario. The only other real suspects, what we found out later, police, of course, investigated Steve Powell to see if he had gone to Utah the week that Susan had disappeared and perhaps helped his son. And they've kind of gone back and forth with that, but I believe they proved he did not leave Washington State. And they didn't really look at Josh's brother Michael until in 2011 or 12, they found out that Michael had been in Utah about the time Susan went missing. And he had, in fact, abandoned his car in a little town in Oregon. And what they pieced together is that 18 hours that Josh was missing and off the grid, Josh rented a car and he drove 800 miles. He met up with Michael, his brother, somewhere. They moved Susan's body. Michael abandoned the car and went back to Puyallup, Washington. When they finally found the car, which is at least 3 years after Susan disappeared.
Wow.
There were dogs. They didn't find Susan's DNA in the car, but the dogs alerted on the car. So I believe they didn't find her DNA, but there had been a decomposed body in the car.
That's amazing to me, right? 3 years later, yeah. And the dogs are still alerting on the car.
Yeah. Well, they're really weird. You can't make this stuff up, as they say.
Right.
There was a detective at this junkyard in Oregon when the phone rings, and the fellow who runs the junkyard answers it, and it's Michael Powell in Minneapolis, Minnesota, wondering if his car was still in the junkyard. And the detective heard this. Yeah, he wasn't there looking for Michael's car. He was there for some other reason. And that let them know that, and then the police went twice after Josh was dead to see Michael in Minnesota, and they told him they had his car because they put it in bubble wrap and, took it back to Utah. And jumping ahead a little bit, but Michael killed himself, committed suicide.
Oh, so yeah, what was Steve's relationship? I didn't understand that dynamic, Steve and Josh, their relationship, because Steve coveted Susan terribly, the whole time. He was under this impression that Susan was going to leave Josh and marry him.
Yeah, and they'd raise the kids.
And they would raise Josh's kids together. But yet Steve and Josh would talk for hours on the phone. They still seemed incredibly close and, confidants in a way. How did that relationship work when, I don't know that I would have that kind of relationship with my father if my father is being very open that he wants to have a relationship with my wife and he thinks my wife loves him.
Yeah. Well, I suppose Josh didn't care.
Oh.
I don't think he cared. He went along with the move to Utah. And I think there was one conversation that Susan related to a friend or her sister or her parents saying, Josh talked to Steve and said, knock it off with the sex stuff and stalking Susan. I mean, we found out later, Steve actually stalked her around Puyallup, was taking pictures when she wasn't looking. And there was a brief time when Josh and Susan lived in his house because they were getting ready to move. And he kept Susan's, in baggies, he kept her tampons, her used tampons. He kept, her toenail clippings. I mean, really, yeah. And so I don't think Josh cared. And the most damning thing that I think people forget about, and that to me pointed to Josh, to premeditation, that Josh had actually thought of this for 2 years,
Yeah.
is in Steve's journal. Amidst all the years of, it's like reading what a 13-year-old boy would write about sex. It was very juvenile. But in the middle of there, Steve is writing that Josh has confided to him. So this is 2 years before Susan went missing. Josh has confided that he wishes Susan was dead, that somebody would come to the door and tell him, she's been in a car accident or something. And that was followed by buying life insurance. We know that's always a red flag.
Right. More circumstantial evidence. Yeah.
More circumstantial. Susan signed, she signed on the dotted line for the life insurance. It was for both of them. And, but he seemed to, and then Steve just jumped on he just defended Josh, to the bitter end.
What about Susan? We haven't talked yet about Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox. What were they doing during this entire time? I know that Chuck had to continuously, and you made more than one point about it in the book. There were multiple times when he wanted to confront Josh, very physically. Let's put it that way. And instead, he would pull back and again tried not to antagonize him too much. Tried to hopefully see if they kept living on that. The information they were getting from the police department, who said, we're working the case, and then nothing really came of it. What were Chuck and Judy going through at that point?
Well, of course, initially they, held out hope that Susan would be found somewhere. Very quickly. Well, I think Chuck's very first news conference, he said that Josh was a good father and husband or something. But a lot of people like Chuck and Kiersey Hillowell knew they had to stay on Josh's good side if they were going to get any information out of him. Chuck warned the state of Washington authorities and the Utah law enforcement authorities that for years he warned them Josh was going to do something, that those kids were in danger. And, they had been taken from their grandfather's house when there was a lot of child pornography found in the house. And when Steve Powell was arrested, and they went to live with their grandparents, but as in foster care technically. And Chuck warned the social workers, warned Child Protective Services, warned the police, warned everybody, Josh is going to do something. He really felt that Josh was being put into a corner, this was not going to end well, because on February 5th, I think it was 2012, they had a custody. And by then, Utah had told Washington State that they'd found child pornography on Josh's computer 3 years before. So if they'd shared that then, he would never have had custody.
Yeah.
They shared it now, and he was ordered to take a polygraph. For the very first time, he would have had to answer questions about Susan, but also take what's called a psychosexual exam to measure if he responded to child pornography, etc. And when he was ordered to take those, that's when he spent 3 or 4 days planning. He took his money out of the bank and left a note for somebody about what bills had to be paid. He bought cans of gasoline. He took some stuff. He took his kids' toys to Goodwill. I mean, he prepared to kill himself and the kids. And again, nobody was watching him. Nobody. Chuck was very anxious that Josh in a corner was not a good thing,
Right.
and he was being cornered.
So they had the pornography on Josh 3 years before, but there was also the pornography that they found for Steve. The Steve got on the FBI's radar basically through his own mouth, right? He did a lot of talking about.
Yeah. Speaking of loose lips,
So he was talking about Susan's journals that he had kept somehow or another. And so was the FBI actually going in to confiscate her journals and then found everything else that they found on him?
Yes, I believe that they had, once he said publicly on television that he was going to publish her teenage journals, then they went in, they had a warrant to go into his house. And that's when they found Steve had 17 computers.
Oh, wow.
And they found miles and miles of child pornography. They found, and this was one of the things that finally tripped up Steve. He was a voyeur. He was taking photographs of the little girls in an adjacent house in the bathroom naked, and developing those pictures and things. So that's what got him arrested and in prison for his first prison stay. There was pornography charge thrown out during his first trial. It was later reinstated, and he later went back to prison for a second time.
So the pornography from Steve was not the reason, though, that the boys were removed? Was it just in conjunction with Josh, or was it also one of the main reasons they were removed?
No, that's why they were removed.
Okay. So they got finally, after there was several years, right? It was 3 or 4 or 5 years, something at that point. Chuck and Judy did essentially have control of the children, and
they were placed. The kids were placed with them just as if they were foster parents, but they were, of course, the grandparents. And they said, the boys were wild.
Mm-hmm.
They, Steve and Josh were not good role models. The boys also told Chuck that their dad slept with them naked. And one of the boys had a funny rash that's almost like an STD, on his limbs.
Mm-hmm.
And they had clearly been emotionally abused and possibly physically abused. Chuck said he one night they were bathing together because they were 5 and 6 years old in his house. After they came to his house, they were bathing together, and one of the boys literally tried to drown the other, and it was not a game. It was not a game. Chuck had interrupted them and stopped it. So something had really happened, and they were. And they vocalized a lot of it, Mormons are bad, Coxes are bad, that's the part I found most heartbreaking is the last couple of years of those kids' lives.
But despite all that, they were still allowing these planned visitations with Josh. They were supposed to have a member of the Child Protective Services there. But I think one of the parts of the book said Chuck had been also watching. Chuck had been watching some of these visitations and noticed that there was no representative from Child Services there at the time, that it was just the boys.
He'd follow them to this house that Josh had rented, and he'd park, across from the backyard. And he would see there was a caseworker, but she might go out in the backyard for a while. And, none of this was her fault. It's the same woman who Josh locked the door and shut her out on the day he killed the kids and himself. But Chuck would pass it along that, she wasn't supposed to ever leave their presence. So they usually, and this is something I feel very strongly about, is that is that visitations should happen in a secure area where there are other people and where there's definitely security around.
Yeah.
The other parents at the building where he had one custodial visit, they didn't, of course, like him, and they didn't want him around. He was a suspect in their eyes in his wife's murder. And so they complained. And so he was allowed to have his visits at a neighbor's house, a neighbor of his father's,
Mm-hmm.
and then at this rental house. So it just far too casual. And as I said, a legislator in Washington State tried to introduce a law that if you're even a person of interest in a spouse's disappearance, you should not have custody of your children. It hasn't gone anywhere. It didn't go anywhere. But well, I think that's an excellent idea.
That was actually one of the last questions I had was, have there been changes made to the child, to either the Child Protective Service process or just child custody in a case like that? And you say there's not at all. There hasn't been any updates.
I don't know of any changes at all. Now, the Coxes just won a $98 million wrongful death suit against Washington State a few months ago because they proved that Washington State Child Protective Services was, had a role in the murder of these kids. A judge has reduced that amount by 2/3, but it's still, they won millions of dollars. I hope it sends a message to other states that, if you look the other way, if you're too lenient, this is what can happen. I'm not aware of any changes in any laws or visitation that has come out of this.
And finally, did the social worker that was with them, it was just a terrible situation for her also.
Yeah.
How has she been affected? If you could you kind of give us just briefly what happened on the morning that she brought the two boys to the rental house?
Yeah. Well, she was highly trained, highly educated woman, and she had this wonderful relationship with the boys. She brought them to the house on this Sunday morning, and as kids do, they hopped out of the car and they ran ahead of her up to the front door. And she called to them. Josh had opened the front door and he stood there, and she said that he grinned at her and shut the door and locked it. And she pounded on the door. She tried to talk to Josh. She said, "You've got to let me in." She called, her first phone call was to her manager, and who I believe told her to call 911. She heard Josh say to the boys, he said, "Charlie, I've got a surprise for you." Charlie was the oldest then. And she began to smell gasoline. She moved her car out of the driveway, and she was frantically, you can hear or see or read the 911 calls she made. The dispatcher, who said later he knew who Josh Powell was, but he just didn't put it together. She said, "This is Josh Powell. I'm afraid he's going to hurt the children." And the dispatcher was asking her questions like, "Well, what color is your car?" And
just ridiculous things.
Who are you?
Yeah.
And so that was two calls, and then finally, the house exploded, and Josh had hit both of his sons in the head with an axe, and then poured gasoline over them and himself, and set the house on fire. And I was the first and only interview she ever gave for many, many years. And I checked in a few years ago, and she'd gone back to work kind of part-time, but had decided she would never take a hard case, the difficult cases. And I don't know if she ever did go back to work, but it was just something you don't ever forget. So it just it blew up the neighborhood. It was, Super Bowl Sunday. I was driving in my car on I-5 and heard on the radio news report that Josh Powell's house had blown up. And I just assumed, like a lot of other people, that it was a gas leak or something. Not that it was intentional, but Chuck had arrived at church, and somebody told him, and he rushed over to the house and saw, the house as it was continuing to burn.
That's really where I was in Ohio at the time. It's where I'm from originally, and that was when I heard. I mean, in Ohio, the disappearance hadn't really made the news that much. When I heard the story was when the house exploded and the father and the boys were inside. So, and that's when they went back and said, he was currently under investigation for the disappearance of his wife 3 years earlier or something like that. Yes. So, I mean, that's where I came into it. And again, if the social worker hadn't moved her car out of the driveway, that exploding house may have also killed her as well. She may have been another victim. Ultimately, she is a victim. She may not have been physically harmed, but she has been mentally damaged from that.
Yeah. I mean, it's just horrendous.
Yeah.
And, I just have a lot of sympathy for her. And it wasn't like she moved the car and then made her 911 calls. She called immediately and was doing what she could. And so I don't know that I would have thought to move the car, but I suppose it was a smart thing to do.
Yeah.
Because the car, I guess the gas could have been in the garage because the car was in front of the garage. I don't know, but
well, those conversations between her and the dispatcher were, again, there were so many things. People, if you have an opportunity to read the book, there were so many pieces of that book that will just mind boggle you and frustrate you and unsettle you. And the conversation she had with the dispatcher was another one of those things. Why the hell are you asking me that question?
Right. Yeah. And yet she kept
going.
Cool.
Yeah.
I mean, she kept going. She did her job. And the thing about that day is, for Josh, and I read up a lot about familial homicide. That's when, a spouse kills themselves and they take the kids with them. Mm-hmm. It's the ultimate revenge. It's getting even. I think Josh was getting even with Susan's parents, getting even with the Mormon church, just getting even.
Yeah, because if he was just trying to escape punishment, he could have done that on his own. He could have blown the house up on his own.
Yeah.
He didn't have to involve the kids.
Right.
Him involving the kids.
It means something different when you take the kids.
And again, I think I mentioned it at the top. The story was ultimately incredibly unfulfilling to me, and life ends that way sometimes. Yeah. There are no guarantee of the appropriate person is going to get found, the body's going to be found, there's going to be an arrest made, everything's going to end up happy. That didn't happen here. Susan has still never been found, and the boys were taken. The boys' lives were taken. Josh never gave any indication as to, again, there's no closure there. I can't imagine being Chuck and Judy. There's absolutely no closure for them. We've never found my daughter, and you took our grandkids away without even telling us why. Why take the grandkids? Why take the boys?
They are
just your mean and vindictive.
Unbelievably strong.
Yeah.
They're, and they have their faith, and they somehow, of course, they didn't disappear and fade away. They wanted something to change. Mm-hmm. And so while I don't think there are any new laws or guidance in the books for Child Protective Services here, they've worked a lot with domestic violence.
Yeah.
They worked a lot with domestic violence in Utah and in Washington State and in Oregon groups. And when I speak to libraries about this book, I would say, if you see something, say something, because, and then, women would come up to me and say, if I told my daughter to leave her husband, she'd never speak to me again. Mm-hmm. Or, I fear that my daughter, domestic violence, but I will lose my relationship with her if I intervene. But I don't know what to say to that. I don't know. Maybe it's still better to intervene. You know, Susan protected her parents. She didn't tell them just how bad life was with Josh. Her friends knew, but she, you know, they did know, and they told her. Chuck had said, you know, come home, bring the boys, come home if you need to. So they'd done it, but they didn't talk a lot about it, and I don't think they knew, you know, how bad things were in the marriage.
And I did appreciate, again, in the book, just the way you wrote the book, there were passages in there that did paint Susan as a real person, and she was not sanitized like a lot of times the victim of a crime in books is sanitized, and she was an angel. And you did bring out a couple of points about Susan in the book where she was a real person. Occasionally she was maybe a little too flirty. Occasionally maybe she said things that ended up being inappropriate that maybe she didn't think they were at the time. There was a passage about a man who made a pass at her, and she's like, did I do something wrong, or did I go too far? And he said, well, yeah, kind of. So there was some of that there. And so it showed you that she was a real person. Yeah. And then that also, you know, quite honestly, it also helped me to think there may have been something completely innocent that she did with Steve when she lived in the house with Steve. Steve interpreted that differently than she meant it. And then that's where this whole
I'm
thing
sure
started.
that happened. That he
interpreted it differently than her. You know, I think that she was...
There was one thing that her mother wanted us to take out of the book, and it was something that I read from Susan's journal when she was a teenager. And I took it out, but it's still alluded to, and you may have picked up on that. But that it wasn't perfect. Mm-hmm. She might have had been intimate with a boy when she was a teenager.
Right.
And I wanted to get to know who Josh was before. You know, a lot of people, you held up the book, I took a lot of heat online when people said, well, why is Josh on the cover of this book? Well, it's a picture of a family.
Yeah.
It's a story about a family.
Well, and it also said, this is only what they want you to see, right?
Yes.
And we live in that society now where everybody has a perfect life on Facebook. Everybody has a perfect life on MySpace, which is probably what they were using back then.
Yes.
Everybody has that perfect life. Everybody's taking this picture, and you don't see what's going on behind it. And so this is one of those situations where this is what they're portraying to the world until she's missing. And so there was never any domestic disturbance calls. There was never any...
No, the police didn't know this family.
There was never any recorded domestic violence issues. She was just gone. And they went from that picture to now she's missing. And now he's acting erratic, and now he's moving away, and now he's hiding his grandchildren or his children and essentially brainwashing them against his grandparents and his mother and their church. And so... I thought that the cover was just fine, and I did appreciate again that it gave equal treatment to as many people as possible, painted them real, showed you that they had flaws like everybody else does, and
a crime happens to a community.
Yeah,
it's not just to a family; it's primarily to a family, but I'm always interested in the community and what was the community like before the crime, and what is it like afterwards. But he got away, didn't he? He just got away with so much.
Yeah. I just kept saying so many things stack up, so many things stacked upon, and there were so many. We talked about this, but I think before the show started, they were on the road. They're on the road to justice. Every act has a road that leads you to justice, and every long place along the road there are junction points, and you can turn left, you can turn right, you can go straight.
Yeah.
And there were so many junction points on that road to justice that would have led to the right outcome, and they just took the wrong turn, and they kept making the wrong decision, and they let him go home and clean his van out. They didn't have somebody tailing him, let him move away to Washington, let him essentially destroy evidence all over the place, and all of those pieces.
There's one thing I wanted to mention if I have a second. So, and that is, and I wrote about this in the book, what Gwen Ifill of PBS called missing white woman syndrome. that
Mm-hmm.
white women who are pretty, white children get a lot more media attention. And I know that, and I admit that, and that I'm part of that usually sometimes, but white women victims are much more, get a lot more media attention. But that, Utah has dozens of unsolved crimes of murders of indigenous women. And so does the Pacific Northwest. And, it's something that I am reading about, and I
Mm-hmm.
would be really interested in writing about, that, Native American women are on and off the reservation are killed all the time.
Yeah.
And nobody pays attention to those crimes, or they're missing dozens of missing women. And, for every Susan Powell, there's, many others, women of color, who are missing or killed. And we need to keep telling Susan's stories, but we need to tell the other stories too.
Agreed. Yeah. Yeah. I would like to think that this story, regardless of race or color,
Yeah.
if this story had happened the exact same way with any color of person, it still would have had the same. It still would have been just as unsettling for me, just as just frustrating for me. And again, I say I read the book and I liked the book, but I would not read the book again. I'll be honest with you, because it made me mad. And I'm not. And my last question for you then is, did that kind of feeling linger with you when you were writing it? Was this something that you were able to compartmentalize that and put it down and move on to the next thing, or was it something that lingered with you afterwards?
Well, this will always be. It's still a part of my life, because I still know the Coxes. I'm still in touch with Susan friends. The book is dedicated to her 7 friends in Utah who had the most, helped the most and were most involved in her life and the search for Susan. And I made 2 trips and got to know them. And I still know these people. And, I really care about the Coxes. And, but, since then I've done probably 3 other books. The Amish book was soon after this. Then I did a memoir about the murder of a high school classmate years ago in Oregon when I was growing up that was never solved. And then the Kyron Horman book. So, and with each one, I can only do justice to it if I get immersed in that story. So,
so maybe that's a good thing that you actually are able to start work, even though the subject matter is pretty dark, right? But at least you're able to then jump into a different thing to focus on.
For some reason, my brain is, and I don't know, maybe it's that, I was a working reporter for 35 years before I ever wrote a book. And you're an observer. You're trained to be an observer. And, and I was in New York City. I was there on 9/11, covered the murder of Amadou Diallo, one of the first, real high profile police shooting cases in the country. Just a lot of different experiences over the years. And I like to talk to people and hear their stories and share their stories and, and try to find out what happened. I don't set out to try to solve a story. That's not, I don't think, what an author's job is, but to, illuminate it, I guess.
Right.
And I think, the most important thing, as I said earlier on, is the lessons to be learned, that in a story like this, like in the Kyron Horman case, when, there was no security at the school. He was missing 6 hours before anybody knew it. He was 7 years old, for God's sake. Nobody knew where he was. Nobody knew he was missing.
Wow.
For 6 hours. And that's, forget the 24 hours being the most important time. For a child, it's 4 hours. You have a 4-hour window to find that child before they're harmed. Most of the time. Anyway,
yeah.
So I think we just need to do better, and maybe changes will.
Agreed. That was what I was hoping. I was hoping that, these things, and I do think that stories like this and retelling these stories and gaining insight into this for the masses, people like me who were on the other side of the country and who didn't hear it real time, raising that awareness can only be a good thing, because it's from our collective voices that change gets made. So if there's only a couple people that know about it and it is not promoted and it is not retold and other people don't know, there will never be real change occur. So I definitely think, and that's part of the reason why I like to have these shows on, ultimately is to tell those stories, keep those stories alive. Like I said, it didn't make me feel good, but that's okay. It wasn't supposed to, probably. Life doesn't always make you feel good.
Reminds us to speak up, show up and speak up.
Absolutely.
And look out for people. And I really think if you see something, say something. If you see a woman or anybody in what could be a dangerous situation, which seems like I think people are just awfully polite and don't want to intrude or get into somebody's business. But
sometimes that's appropriate. Sometimes it's appropriate to become involved.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for joining me tonight. I really appreciate you coming on and spending time with me. And once again, everybody, the book is titled "If I Can't Have You: Susan Powell, Her Mysterious Disappearance and the Murder of Her Children." And the website where you can find it is RebeccaTMorris.com. And you can also find them on Amazon.com as well. Hopefully have a great evening. Thanks again for joining me.
Okay.
And we can talk
Peter.
again soon.
I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Hope to talk to you again.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks.
So, Rebecca Morris, once again, we were talking about the case of Susan Powell. And the case of Susan Powell, potentially similar to Chris Watts and Shalane Watts, with the difference that Shalane and the children were found very quickly. Chris was apprehended very quickly. As bad as it was with Shalane and the children being murdered, at least there was the justification and the retribution of his capture, his sentencing, ultimately his conviction. That just did not happen in this case, the Susan Powell case. Susan went missing. Susan has never been found, ever to be found again. Her children were left with an abusive father for years when he was a person of interest, a suspect in her disappearance and her murder. Those things have to change. They really do. If there is enough evidence, and I think there was enough circumstantial evidence against Josh Powell, again, him just doing really creepy things, him calling her phone when her phone is sitting right in the seat next to him. He knew her phone was there. He was calling it anyway to create his alibi, but he wasn't smart enough to get rid of the phone. He wasn't smart enough to, I have premeditated, essentially. He must have premeditated something in that night. But I'm going to leave I'm going to leave her purse, I'm going to leave her phone in the car, I'm going to leave all of these things right here, essentially for me to get caught. He was not overly smart in terms of the follow-through. That was his whole life. His whole life was the grand idea and the terrible follow-through. And unfortunately, Susan was part of that. But he was still able to move. He was able to clean the house, rent the house, move away from Utah, back to his father's place. Never was compelled to come in and really spend time with the police that normal grieving fathers or grieving husbands would have. A husband who really had nothing to hide would have been doing everything he could to search for his wife, not moving away from the area within a month. He was gone. His wife hadn't even been gone a month, and he was out of there. He was in Washington. Like I mentioned to her, I enjoyed the book. It was well written. I would not read it again because it did not make you feel good. Sometimes bad things they obviously don't make you feel good. But it is a story that I think it's riveting. It will frustrate you, just the loopholes and the places in the system where there could have been justice. Could have been justice for Susan, and could have been a better ending for the boys. The boys were the ultimate victims in this, just as much as Susan. Nothing to do with their marital strife. Just caught in a tornado, and they had nothing. And there was no place for them to go. What are your thoughts? Have you read the book? Are there cases like this around for you? How did you feel about the Susan Powell case? You can send us a line on our Gmail account. It's provemewrongcast@gmail.com. That's our email. You can also leave us a message on Facebook or Instagram with Prove Me Wrong, facebook.com/Prove Me Wrong, or Instagram /Prove Me Wrong. Either one of those, you can find us. If you were just looking for ways to listen to the podcast itself, we are on all podcast platforms. We're on TuneIn, Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iTunes. Any app that you use to find podcasts, you can find the Prove Me Wrong podcast. Like and subscribe to the show, and you'll be notified when a brand new episode is released. And we typically release them every month, and we change up the topics quite a bit. So, because I was talking to Susan or to Rebecca before the show started, stories like this, if I knew I was going into one of these every week, it would be hard on me. This one lingered with me for a while. It was very disturbing and not very fulfilling. But like and subscribe, and you'll be notified when a brand new episode releases. Also, if you like what we do here, we do have a Patreon account, patreon.com/PMW podcast. You can become a patron of the show, and we do provide additional content only to our Patreon subscribers, and you can hear episodes that no one else has heard. So if you want to go on that, again, patreon.com/PMW podcast, become a patron, and you can enjoy some of the additional content that the Prove Me Wrong podcast has to offer. Also, if you are watching on YouTube or Rumble, we are also on YouTube and Rumble video accounts. You could have watched Rebecca and I have a conversation tonight. YouTube.com/Prove Me Wrong and Rumble.com/Prove Me Wrong. Like and subscribe to those two channels, and you will be notified when a brand new episode releases, and you can watch the video portion of the episode. Now, before we go, our sponsor tonight is ZendoZone Citronella Burners from JT Eden. I have my own ZendoZone right here. They're shaped like fearless bug-repellent tiki gods. There he is. So let Surf and Stan, Hawaiian Howie, and Luau Lily bring the islands to your backyard with ZendoZone Citronella Burners. They're shaped like fearless bug-repellent tiki gods, and they use natural 3% citronella candles and incense cones. They're perfect for patios, decks, backyards, campsites, poolside, and more. And you can enjoy the outdoors again. They are available on Amazon.com and at select Ace Hardware stores. So go ahead and pick up yours today. So once again, for my guest host, Rebecca Morris, we talked about the Susan Cox Powell story. The book was titled If I Can't Have You. My name is Pete Lieb. This is the Prove Me Wrong podcast, and we will see you again soon.